Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. The writing on a nearby marquee said "wicked," and that certainly described the disaster as a hotel construction project collapsed. We will discuss the tragedy that took place on a day already made busy by state and local elections. All of this, plus the latest boil water advisory, are on the agenda for our Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Clancy Dubose, political editor, Gambit Weekly. Dave Cohen, news director, WWL Radio. And Stephanie Grace, columnist, The Times-Picayune, New Orleans Advocate. And Dave, we're going to go over to you. Boy, it's something that's just really stunned everybody in this region. I mean, all over the country, really. Partial collapse of the Hard Rock Hotel that was under construction downtown. What happened?
Well, we should start by saying we have far more questions than we have answers, even now, 6 days after this tragedy began. What we do know is that during the construction on Saturday morning, right around 9 a.m., people in the building, there were 112 people in the construction project at the time, started hearing creaking noises, started hearing glass shattering, and they ran for their lives. Thank God most of them got out in time. 3 people apparently did not. And we know that the building started pancaking one floor after another on the upper sections of that construction project. And immediately we knew one person was confirmed dead. They later were able to visually confirm a second death. And there's still a third person who is officially listed as missing, but they have transitioned from an effort to rescue that person to an effort to recover that person, even though they still have not actually found any evidence of the body. They believe it's under the rubble. They can't go in. They can't get searchers and recovery teams into several portions of the building yet for a number of reasons. The thing that has the most concern, and much of the talk the last several days, has been about those towering cranes that are more than 18 stories tall that sit over the project, both of which are leaning, both of which the contractors can't believe haven't fallen yet. And so they've been spending the last day and a half placing explosive charges on the horizontal portions of those cranes, the big long arms that are hanging over the project and partially over other areas, and been cutting pieces. And they tell us that tomorrow morning at some point they'll get the go-ahead. And shortly after noon, we expect they will implode both of those cranes, bringing them down, they anticipate, right where they stand. They say they've got the best people in the world who know how to do this, who have done this many, many times. And so the plan is to, sometime shortly after noon, go ahead and make that happen. Once they get those cranes down, they feel a little better about the safety of the area surrounding the building. You know, the biggest fear is that one of those cranes falls and goes through the Sanger Theater, for example, or falls across Canal Street, or falls in the middle of that building and brings down the whole thing, which then has a reverberant effect. So they want to get those cranes down, then they want to get those bodies out, then they want to look at, okay, where do we go next with stabilizing what's left, what can be saved, if anything, and investigating what happened.
Well,
I wonder, okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead,
I
Clancy.
just wonder if, and we've all had conversations with people we know about this. As many, even, you know what I do for a living, I've had as many conversations about the Hard Rock Cafe as I've had about the governor's race with people. I wonder if, on the subject of how much can be salvaged, anybody who's going to go to that site to build something is not going to want to salvage anything. They're going to want to take it down to the dirt for lots of reasons: safety, certainty, and liability going forward. I would think. I can't imagine anybody would say, "Well, we'll salvage the first 2 floors."
And
who would want to come build on that?
Much of the talk that we're
If
hearing.
it's a hotel.
Yeah,
I mean,
Exactly. And that's a lot of question now. And both economically speaking, in terms of liability, and so many other, There's a lot of people questioning now, will anything ever end up on that site at this point? Will Hard Rock want to be involved in the project beyond this? Will, based on the lawsuits and the allegations, and we have so many allegations now that some have been filed in the form of lawsuits, some have come up through investigative reporting, and some, it seems everybody on social media now is a engineer and a construction expert. So we're hearing all kinds of allegations of what may or may not have led to the collapse. But still, there's been no evidence gathered whatsoever. And that's another question. Because it's in litigation now, because lawsuits have already been filed, and there will be more, there are going to be efforts to preserve that evidence.
Right.
Well, they have to be.
So the question becomes, how much can they do at that site?
And is it
Anytime
stable?
soon.
Once the cranes are gone, how stable is what's left of the building?
There's a whole wall that the fire chief keeps talking about that's unsupported at this point.
On the Rampart side.
On the Rampart side that they want to take down. That may be litigated, though, on whether or not they can take
And
that
it's
down.
such a busy intersection. I mean, you just see the video of when it came down, and you imagine if it had been a different time of day, if people had been going into the Sanger or rush hour, people in gridlock.
And there's
Imagine they'd had the Sanger full of people going to see Wicked.
Right.
To see Wicked, right.
And
A couple hours later.
a couple
Yeah.
hours later, they're lining up to go in, or they're coming out when this thing comes
the
down.
side
It's a-
door,
You
right
can
there.
imagine, and there's underground infrastructure too.
And
there
streetcar, all
are
of it.
experts that have been involved in the Mara building in Oklahoma City after 9/11, but this is kind of unique because it's right there on the edge of a pretty dense area called the French Quarter.
And we can't find where there's ever been a major implosion demolition done in the French Quarter itself. And the city officials are concerned about a gas line that runs under there. There's electrical that runs under there. So those are things they're all having to take into account just to take down these cranes, let alone to take down the rest of the building. But Clancy, I think you're right. I think before it's over, it's most likely that there's nothing left on that site, that they're going to have to, at some point, completely remove the entire project and start from scratch. And then at that point, you're going to have new developers, you're going to have new projects, you're going to questions about whether the city is going to permit something there. It was very difficult to get this project green lighted.
Right.
That was a
very
political
controversial.
struggle because it's a huge building in the French Quarter.
Right. E, did you have something?
Yep. But one theory you hear a good bit is about the swimming pool. And I know from talking to you that you have your own thoughts about that.
Well, obviously, there's so much speculation. We know that there was a massive swimming pool lifted by one of those cranes to the upper levels of the structure hours before it collapsed. And many wonder, okay, well, did the weight of that pool cause the collapse? Others say, though, wait a minute, the pool's still sitting there. They had to go in and put a drain in the pool in anticipation of rain so it wouldn't increase the weight on that to cause further collapse. Now, there's been engineering debate on placing a pool on one side. Could that affect the other side? There's so many questions that we've heard in the reporting about were there structural supports placed
Right.
in the right locations and were they close enough?
We've all heard those. About
Was there rebar that was supposed to be in the concrete that was removed from the project? Were there corners cut?
There's that video,
But-
there's a very dramatic video from a worker basically saying before it fell that there aren't enough structures.
Right, which the
and that's
contractor-
alarming.
Which the contractor has said, well, we're not so sure about this video, that it's actually of this location.
But there are alarming things that people have seen in pictures and video. We have talked to a number of structural engineers who say that many of the allegations are very concerning, that there are reasons to take them very seriously and to be worried that maybe that did contribute. But others say subcontractors and workers may not always be familiar with the latest technology, with the latest information in terms of the engineering, that there are different materials that can be used, that can be placed at different spans, and obviously there's going to be a lot of speculation, but eventually they're going to get to the bottom of this. And then the whole other thing is the question about the Safety and Permits Office
Yeah.
Right.
in New Orleans when we know there's an investigation
Right.
into alleged corruption in that office.
Well, we could take up this whole half hour about this discussion, and we're just beginning, really, our discussions about it in the weeks to come. OSHA was there first thing on Saturday, but they really haven't been able to get in until they're able to remove the remains and get the cranes out of there. So
stabilize
a
it, yeah.
lot of
There are two
investigation and
bodies
research
still
going to
in
have to
there.
go on there. Yeah. All righty, Dave. Thanks a lot. And by the way, there was a governor's race plus other elections on that same day. We have a runoff for governor, Clarence.
Yes, and a very hotly contested one. you know, I don't think there's an accurate poll out there yet, and the race is just beginning. This is a 5-week runoff, so it's not the usual 4-week runoff, and not quite the old-time 6-week runoff that Earl and I knew when we were younger reporters. So there's a lot of ground left to be covered, a lot of mud left to be slung, and it will be slung. Interestingly, the most interesting development this week was the sudden publicity surrounding a guy who's been in the background as far as the public is concerned, but very much in the foreground among the political class, a guy named Lane Grigsby, who is he's a Republican donor, but he's really more like a Louisiana oligarch. Is
Or
what he
a
really
kingmaker,
is.
if you actually
To
listen
his
to
words.
him. He said
well,
that.
that's what an oligarch is, I
Yes.
think.
You're not supposed
he,
to say it out loud.
Well, but till he
But
said
he
it.
did, yes.
And that's arrogance will get you every time. So I'm sure there will be some commercials, because Eddie Risponi has already described in the primary and before that Lane Grigsby, who was a very wealthy Baton Rouge guy, contractor, made hundreds of millions of dollars, very successful in his contracting business, taught Eddie Risponi or helped him get started as a contractor himself, Risponi that is. So, and Risponi has said that Grigsby is one of his, or is his main political mentor.
We should probably say what the controversy was, which did not have to
Yes.
do with the governor's
That's
race. It
right.
had to
Go
do with
ahead.
the
You
state
take
senate
that.
race in Baton Rouge. We almost had a very strange situation where there was going to be a 3-way runoff because 2 candidates tied, 2 Republican candidates, both sitting state reps in an open Senate district against a Democrat.
Tied for second.
Tied for second. So that means plurality. You don't need a majority to win. That would have been very unusual and probably would have favored the Democrat. Lane Grigsby, who lives in that district, Republican, wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So he went to one of the candidates. He didn't go to him, he went to the incumbent, so kind of tried to send a message that said, if you get out, I'll support you for a future judge race. And then he said he did that in public, and that's what blew up. And that's what the John Bel Edwards camp really seized on and said, oh, by the way, he's Eddie Risponi's mentor, basically.
Yeah, and Grigsby called the incumbent Senator Dan Claytor, who was supporting the candidate
Franklin Foyle is his name.
Franklin Foyle, a state rep, and that's the candidate that Grigsby wanted to get out.
Yeah.
And so the question became a lot of questions. One of them was, well, was that an offer of a bribe because it's something of value to get out? And there's a state law right on point, except that the offer technically wasn't delivered because Claytor said, this doesn't pass the smell test.
Right.
So he didn't deliver the message.
And then
But let's get back to the governor.
quickly, the end of that story
So-
is there was a recount and Foyle won by 1 vote,
Okay.
so he's in the runoff.
So
it's
he made the offer too soon. But
but
it's
the
going
point
to
you're
be a big
making is
issue.
that Grigsby is going to be something you want to be hearing
I
about.
expect to see Grigsby
Yes.
to be portrayed as some sort of dark Svengali
Yep.
type figure,
And he's a
pulling the
figure
strings
that's
of Eddie Risponi if Eddie Risponi wins.
very active in the school reform movement. He supported a lot of Bessie candidates. He was active. There was a PAC that did negative ads against Desiree Charbonnet in the mayoral race with Leslie Jacobs. He was active in that. I mean, he's everywhere.
Grigsby spends a lot of money. Now, the bigger picture is,
Yes.
what do we really know about Eddie Risponi? We know a lot about John Bel Edwards. He's had 8 years in the
He has an
legislature.
R next to his name. That could be enough.
And Edwards had 4
Drives a
years as
truck
a
and he
governor.
likes President Trump.
A lot.
Not necessarily in that order. And so, but I think it's going to be up to Edwards to make people sort of shock people, as it were, to say, hey, what do you really know
Or
about this
to
guy?
scare
Think long
them,
and hard.
really. I
Yes,
think he has to get,
exactly.
especially when you look at, Orleans underperformed for him. That's where he has a lot of votes, the whole New Orleans area. One thing John Bel Edwards did is he said, Eddie Risponi might go after Medicaid. Remember that. Now Eddie Risponi wants to keep Medicaid expansion, but he wants to freeze it. So that's something that could kind of scare people maybe to the voting booth. He's working on that. He's an incumbent and he got 47%. So that is a problem. He's a Democrat who got 47%. The Republicans got 52% total. So that's a problem. But on the other hand, 47 is pretty close to 50. So he's got to get some votes. There are probably some votes for him in Ralph Abraham's district, the third candidate who didn't make the runoff, who's a congressman from North Louisiana. Maybe some of those votes aren't automatically Republican votes. A lot probably are.
Did Orleans turn out for him
No.
to the number that
The
they expected?
statewide turnout was about 45.6%. The turnout in Orleans was 38%.
Does that fall on the mayor?
The mayor was in Copenhagen.
Copenhagen,
You know what? The
yes.
mayor, that's a very good question. The mayor owes the governor. She may not think she owes the governor, but if she thinks that she got the fair share plan through the legislature herself, she needs to look at the results on Amendment 4. She did her affordable housing tour around the state, which in that amendment needed to pass statewide and in Orleans. The only parish where it passed was Orleans. She failed miserably, and then she went to Copenhagen the week of the election, in which she should have been here, frankly, politically, trying to get turnout for John Bell Edwards.
So does Edwards say to her, why didn't you deliver for
well,
me?
I don't know
Where-
if he says that, because who knows what she's thinking. I'm hearing from
Or
people
does
that
she
she
really-
thinks that she didn't know the governor. Well, wait till she meets Governor Risponi.
Right.
Doesn't she
thinks
want a
that-
Democrat
Well, you would
in the
think so.
governor's
Who knows?
mansion?
And the other thing is, the day of the runoff, she's got a bunch of stuff that she wants on the ballot. So
Mm-hmm.
she better be here. You know, she has a millage, she has that fair share tax on Airbnb, and
She's got two
she's-
big things.
So
on the
Orleans
ballot.
really does need to be mobilized
Yes.
for more reasons than one. Okay, we'll continue to talk about this. We now need to talk about Jefferson
Yes.
Parish elections over there too.
Yeah, in Jefferson Parish, there was the sheriff's race and there was a parish president's race among others. But in those two races, the results were almost the same. The winner had like in the 60 percentile, the runner-up had like in the 30 percentile, and there was a third person that had like in the 6 percentile. And so it was the same type of pattern. But Cynthia Lee showing one for parish president. The feeling was during the campaign was that she was the front runner. Some of the polls were showing, and if you talk to the politicians, they'd say that. I think it might have been a bigger vote than people had anticipated, but it was a major change. In the council at large race, Scott Walker won against Mr. Johnson, who had been a former councilman in Harahan and the former mayor of Harahan.
And Paul Johnson had a whole machine
yeah,
behind
and
him.
the council-
Walker had almost no money.
Yeah.
Right.
Now Jefferson Parish has two members on the council who are former TV
Right.
people,
Right.
with Jennifer Van Vranken, who used to be with
and then
Channel 8,
Helena
and Scott
Moreno in
Walker,
the New Orleans
who's,
City Council, so three
who's
in the
an
area.
anchor on Channel 6.
Yeah, that's
Interesting about the races in Walker's race over Johnston and Lee Shang's victory over John Young. It appears that if you looked at the polls, the undecided vote and the African American vote, which is over 30% registration at least in Jefferson Parish, all broke at the last minute for both Lee Shang and for Walker. Although Walker was polling a little bit ahead, but not 57-43. So that's a
And there was some
significant break.
speculation that Lee Shang wouldn't do well with the black vote because of some long-held resentment from
Well,
Harry Lee and all
Well, it's
that.
not so much that. It's that
Yeah.
both Lee Shang and Young were both Republicans,
Republicans,
and there
yeah.
was another person in the race who was an independent, which is closer to Democrat than Republican.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the African American
mean-
vote broke for Lee Shang.
You really have to look at her and say she's a rising star with that vote total. She beat a
Yeah.
former parish president by, what, 20
Yeah,
points?
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
real strong showing.
Yeah.
Also, there was sheriff's race. In
Yeah,
January.
well, we already had the
Kind
sheriff elected, and so this was sort of like the follow through, and
Yeah.
so that turned out to be. It was probably a race that shouldn't have happened. I don't think.
That was never going to be a close race.
Yeah, I don't think. Fortunately,
He was polling
just-
30
just-
plus
just-
points ahead. And
He
that's
had no
what
money.
did.
Yeah.
All right, okie doke. Well, other races then that happened last Saturday were statewide legislative races, also Orleans and other sections
Right.
also.
Well, the whole legislature was up,
Right.
and there was a lot of turnover. There was always going to be a lot of turnover because this is the year a lot of people were termed out. Term limits hit. So, still a lot of races to go in Orleans. To me, that's part of the story. Most of the other races, not all of them in the area, are settled. There are, I counted 6 runoffs in districts that include Orleans. Some of them go into Jefferson Parish and other places. So some pretty hot ones. And again, we're losing some major figures in the legislature. Of course, the biggest one is John Lario from Jefferson Parish. Pat Connick was elected without opposition to replace him. But Neil Abramson, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, J.P. Morrell, Walt Leger, Speaker Pro Tem.
Danny Martini. is going
Danny
to-
Martini.
yeah.
So his race was settled. Kirk Talbot was elected. He's a state rep. So some big runoffs. There are in Neil Abramson's district, Amy Freeman versus Kia Sherman. That was a really contested race. So 2 women. So that's interesting. We'll get some more women, I think, in Orleans anyway.
Although there were a record number of women running
There were.
in legislative races,
Yes.
but
And-
still a record low number of women winning seats.
There was a concerted effort to do that because we had one of the lowest representation, we have fewer women than most legislatures. That's the way I should put it. Mandy Landry against Robert McKnight in the Walt-Leger district. Matthew Willard versus Eugene Green, two familiar names, familiar families. That's the Joe Bowie district. Joe Bowie's running to replace J.P. Morrell against another sitting legislator, John Bagneris. So they're in a runoff. That's a district. That's Orleans, St. Bernard, and West Bank of Jefferson. There's a Ninth Ward district. Adonis Expose and Candace Newell is her name, right? So there's so again, when we talk about Orleans.
And where we are here,
turnout,
District 94,
there's
incumbent Stephanie
of
Hilferty.
course, I forgot
It's a
that one.
district that crosses, it's the lakefront and mid-city of New Orleans and Bucktown, New Metairie in Jefferson Parish. It's about 60-40 Orleans-Jefferson. Hilferty, the incumbent, was pushed to a runoff against another woman
Right.
who's a Democrat. So that district kind of favors Republicans, but you can't take anything for
Well,
granted.
do we end up with a supermajority in both the House and the Senate?
We're
Especially
very,
with redistricting coming up after the 2020 census.
We're very, very close. And then with the prospect, a pretty decent prospect of a Republican governor, we could turn really partisan in Baton Rouge, even more than we have. One thing to watch is if there is a supermajority, that means it's a veto-proof majority for if John Bel Edwards is reelected. Are those Republicans do they stick with the Republican Party? Because Stephanie Hilferty, people like her, there are some moderate Republicans who have been willing to work with the governor, have not been strictly partisan. Now there are Republicans who are targeting them, and in fact we have some runoffs in other part of the state where you have a moderate Republican versus a more conservative Republican. There's a group that used to be called the Committee for a Republican Majority, founded by David Vitter, now run by Jeff Landry and John Kennedy, and it's now called Committee for a Conservative Majority because they're trying to get rid of those moderate Republicans. Rhinos, Republicans in name only is what they would call them. So that's a dynamic here too.
Which is an interesting name coming from a guy like John Kennedy, who was a liberal
Exactly.
Democrat 10 years ago.
Oh, there's
12
that.
years ago.
Yes.
Anyway.
So statewide races, there's a runoff for what,
Secretary of State, Kyle Ardoin, who was elected for the first time. He was the deputy to Tom Shedler, who had to resign because of sexual harassment. He's going to face basically the same Democrat he faced last time, and he would be favored. It's all the other Republicans won handily.
You wonder if people like Nungesser and Jeff Landry for a word about winning, because you kind of think maybe they were eyeing running for governor in 4 years.
And then people like Garrett Graves, the congressman from Baton Rouge, I think there was a lot of that. I think people were trying to figure out what happened in 4 years. Now, if Risponi wins, maybe it's 8 years.
Right. Supreme Court also, there was a race. Can you address that?
Yeah, the runoff there is, first of all, the district is significant portions of the North Shore, all of St. Tammany, all of Washington, all of Tangipahoa, and all of St. Helena Parish, and all of I believe all, or just about all of the East Bank of Jefferson Parish, a little bit of the West Bank of Jefferson, and kind of sort of Stephanie Hilferty's Orleans portion district, the lakefront, maybe part of Mid-City a little bit. Not a big part of the district is in Orleans, but certainly Lakeview Lakefront is part of that district. And it's a conservative district. It kind of mirrors, in some ways, Steve Scalise's old district before it included St. Bernard and Lafourche and all that, and St. Charles. But for a long time, it was held by Pascal Calagero, who was part of the so-called liberal majority, 4-3 majority. Then it was when Calagero retired, it was won by Greg Guidry, a Republican judge in Jefferson Parish, and he held it until he got appointed to the U.S. District Court. So now that he's been appointed, this is a special election. There's one candidate, Will Crane, who's a sitting judge from the North Shore, versus Hans Liljeburg, who's an appellate court. They're both appellate court judges. Liljeburg is on the appellate court on the South Shore. So the North Shore component is 61% of the registered vote. But Liljeburg has gotten some support on the North Shore. So that could be a really close race.
An interesting race. Okay, all righty. We're going to go now to another thing that happened last Saturday. It was definitely a busy day, and that was a water main breaking in Uptown and Panola Street causing a boil water advisory, and then a second one on the heels of it.
It was another one of these more than century-old water mains, massive pipes that gave way, and if you saw the video of the water and everything else shooting up out of the street and the flooding that ensued, it was very obvious what had happened. This situation was made even more complicated, though, by the fact that Surgeon Water Board moved pretty quickly to repair it and got it fixed and went ahead and lifted the boil water advisory. 3 hours later, they had to reissue the boil water advisory once again for all of uptown New Orleans because they had increased the pressure too quickly after replacing the pipe, which led to a pressure drop, which then mandated another boil water advisory. And the Surgeon Water Board, in its defense, it keeps saying, hey, we've got all these pipes that are well beyond their useful life and they're going to break. This was not one where you can, like the last major boil water advisory, where you can say, oh, well, someone was literally asleep at the switch. Or where you can say someone who tried to make the situation better made the wrong decision and made it worse by shutting down another pump and generator. It's a city with old pipes, and it goes back to the argument that you're going to at some point need billions of dollars to replace the aging infrastructure.
This was a more than 100-year-old pipe that burst, and boy, when it burst, it did. It just threw off chunks of
Was
big
it like a
chunks of
3-foot
mud.
main or something? 3
It
foot?
was a major one, yeah.
36 inch, yeah.
And the video of the flood it caused, it was like a river flowing down that street.
Yeah, and to some extent, I think people are so frustrated and so upset by this that maybe that helps the effort to generate more revenue for infrastructure. But at the same time, others say, wait a minute, this money for infrastructure, though, is also for police, it's also for firemen, it's also for equipment.
And this is what will be in the ballot on November
And this
16th.
is-
And
exactly.
that is
Yeah.
something that we're
Ballot
going to
number.
talk about in
And
future
after
weeks,
people
because
got
right
higher
now
assessments.
we need to talk about looking ahead, because we're just about out of time. Hey,
Well, brace yourself. It's about to happen with sports. So they got a lot of excitement with football. Tuesday night, the Pelicans open up for real the regular season, and they're opening up against the defending champions, the Toronto Raptors. But it's going to be a big season, even though Zion Williams is out the first few games with an injury.
that is just a heartbreak, isn't
So
it?
next week we'll have Zion Williams and Drew Brees both sitting out injured.
All right. What's up with you, can I see?
Well, I think we will see an announcement on the debate. If there's going to be a governor's debate, it will be announced very soon. Maybe hopefully a series of them, and lots of attack ads.
Well, Edwards has already
He's
accepted a
agreed.
debate, right?
But we're waiting on.
Well, the ads have started already. You started
Yes.
seeing them coming right away, and they're not too nice.
They're going to get worse.
They-
Well, I'll go back to the sports angle. You had doom and gloom. Let's talk about the good news. The fact that LSU, we're talking about all these things that happened Saturday. LSU beat Florida on Saturday and become the #2 ranked team in the nation. The college football championship is in New Orleans this year. So could we again have LSU, which is now ranked #2? Of course, Alabama's won. Could we again have LSU playing for a national championship in the Superdome? Wouldn't that be great?
That would be really exciting.
Against Alabama.
Yes. Wow. And back to politics. You mentioned the big race in the North Shore. Watch the North Shore because there are two big runoffs, the parish president's race and the sheriff race. In both cases, incumbents forced into runoffs. So that'll be active.
St. Tammany,
What did I say?
North Shore.
St. Tammany. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
And LSU did get accolade this week. At least the fans did, for drinking the most beer. Or something.
Yes, they just this year started selling beer and wine stadium-wide, and they sold 55,000 servings of beer, which outnumbered all the servings of water and soda
Oh my
at
goodness.
the Florida game.
Yeah,
A new
real
record.
champs at that. All right. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.